Welcome back, and this episode gets weird in the best way. We're talking cancer biology, immune defenses, gut bacteria, and why skinny does not always mean healthy. And honestly, the fat conversation gets way more dangerous than people think. Wait, the biopsy is no longer just a diagnosis, right? That whole idea of sequencing the tumor and the normal tissue changes everything. Because you're not just naming the cancer, you're hunting the actual mutations. Exactly, and that makes cancer feel less like a black box and more like a target. But the wild part is how much of this still depends on the immune system doing the heavy lifting. Right. The idea is not just kill the tumor, it's wake up the body. That part sounds almost too elegant for oncology. No, but that's the shift. Because some patients are basically being vaccinated with their own cancer. That line is insane, by the way. And the fact that this is already showing results in glioblastoma is not small. Brain cancer is one of those diagnoses that feels brutally final. So when you hear about someone thriving 7 years later, it just messes with your assumptions. That's why the immune system part matters so much. But then the conversation gets even stranger with the gut bacteria thing. One bacteria becomes the star of the whole show. Akkermansia mucinifera basically separated responders from non-responders in that immunotherapy study. That is such a ridiculous name for something so important. Biology really loves making the biggest things sound like spell names. And then the crazy move was putting that bacteria into mice and reviving the response. That's where the whole thing stops sounding like wellness fluff and starts sounding like real science. But what I liked is that he did not stop at probiotics and call it a day. He connected it to food, which is way more interesting than just swallowing one capsule and praying. DIY Akkermansia is such a strange phrase, though. Like you're in your kitchen running a microbial startup. But pomegranate, cranberries, Concord grapes, chili peppers, even black vinegar are doing real work there. Which is exactly why the diet conversation gets so messy. Because people want one heroic diet and the body wants a sustainable pattern. The body refuses to be bullied by keto influencers forever. That is the most accurate thing in this whole episode. I think his point about diets being short-term tools is actually pretty strong. Because who actually lives raw food perfect or carnivore perfect for decades? Nobody who enjoys restaurants, apparently. Exactly, and that's why he keeps coming back to Mediterranean and Asian food patterns. Fresh, seasonal, plant-forward, delicious, and you can actually repeat it. That repetition is the underrated part. The Japan piece was fascinating too, because it was less about magic food and more about restraint. Harahachi banh mi is basically stop at 80% full, which is humiliatingly hard for most people, let's be honest. Especially in a world built around oversized portions and constant snacks. And then the DEXA scan story hits because it destroys the idea that slim equals safe. A slim guy getting told he is overnourished is such a nightmare diagnosis. But that's really just excess fuel stored in the wrong place. Visceral fat is the hidden problem, not the obvious body shape. So the outside can look neat while the inside is a disaster. That suitcase analogy is brutal because everyone instantly gets it. And the main point is that this fat is inflammatory, not passive. That's why it starts linking to cancer, heart disease, diabetes, all of it. He makes that connection really clearly when he talks about the fat starving itself of blood supply. Once it becomes hypoxic, it basically turns into a biochemical problem factory. And people still think fat is just about aesthetics. No, it can literally leak inflammation everywhere. That is the part that makes cancer risk make sense, because inflammation feeds the fire. The breast cancer study was especially sobering. Normal-sized women with more body fat had a 3-fold higher risk over 13 years. That's the kind of statistic that ruins casual confidence. But it also gives you leverage, because it means the body is not random chaos. So then brown fat becomes the fun part of the story, right? The good fat that attacks the bad fat is a great comic book idea. Yet it is real, and cold exposure can activate it. Humans really needed a built-in furnace hidden under the skin. And now the cold plunge crowd gets to feel scientifically validated for once. They were waiting for their moment. But the deeper point is that lifestyle is not some weak add-on to medicine. It changes hormones, inflammation, fat storage, and maybe treatment response too. That's the part I think people underestimate. The body is constantly deciding whether to defend, repair, or inflame. And food is one of the main inputs into that decision, which is terrifying and kind of empowering at the same time. So if you pull all of this together, cancer treatment is getting smarter, but prevention is still everyday behavior. That's the tension of the episode, really. High-tech medicine on one side, and very ordinary food choices on the other. The future is protein printers and pomegranates. That should absolutely be the title of something. All right, let's leave it there for this one. We'll come back with even more of the prevention and longevity angle next time. And in episode 4, we're getting into the bigger question of what actually makes a long, healthy life. Welcome back. And this one gets wild fast with cancer biology, gut bacteria, and the fat you do not see. We go from tumor genetics to pomegranates, then somehow end up inside a body suitcase. That is the most elegant way to describe visceral fat I have ever heard. And the crazy part is the body is not just passively breaking down. It is defending, adapting, and sometimes failing in very specific ways. Right, and that is where the whole cancer story starts getting less random. Because the idea is not just mutation equals cancer, but mutation plus failure of defense. Exactly, and that changes how you think about prevention completely. Wait, so the old biopsy model was basically just what? Identify and pray? Identify, panic, and then open the treatment book like a cursed recipe. That is brutal, but yes, that was the vibe. And now the idea is biopsy plus full genome sequencing plus AI comparison. That part is genuinely futuristic, because now you are hunting the real smoking guns. Not every mutation, just the ones that actually drove that cancer. That pearl necklace analogy was actually insanely good. It sounds ridiculous for 3 seconds, then your brain goes, oh, I get it. And then you print those proteins and basically train the immune system. Vaccinating yourself with your own cancer is a crazy sentence. But that is the whole point, right? The body gets a wanted poster and starts fighting back with precision. And that is already showing up in real trials, not just theory. Glioblastoma survival stories sound almost impossible until you hear them twice. That is the part that gives people actual hope instead of fake optimism. But then the gut bacteria piece comes in and gets even stranger, because apparently one bacteria can change whether immunotherapy works. Akkermansia muciniphila is such a villain name and such a hero at the same time. It sounds like a final boss in a biology textbook. And yet the point is so simple. Some responders had it, non-responders did not. Then they moved it into mice, and suddenly the immune response came back online. That is the kind of result that makes a room go silent. Also, this is where people hear probiotics and immediately start acting like pharmacists. Yeah, like one capsule, and now I am basically immunotherapy ready. But the bigger idea is more interesting than the shortcut. Food can help shape the ecosystem that helps the treatment work better. So pomegranate, cranberries, grapes, chili peppers, even black vinegar become strategy. The most aggressive cancer support plan is apparently a condiment cabinet. That is ridiculous, but I love it. And it leads right into the diet argument, which is where people usually get religious. Keto people talk like they found hidden scripture. Carnivore people sound like they are fleeing civilization. Raw food people act like chewing is a moral failure. The pushback here is basically that most diets are too extreme to live with. If you cannot sustain it, the science does not matter very much. Right, because the body does not care about your 3-week enthusiasm. That is a devastating line for every diet influencer ever. The real preference is this very boring-sounding but powerful idea, sustainable eating. Mediterranean style, plant-forward, seasonal, actual food that tastes good. That was the funny thing, because the argument was not anti-pleasure at all. It was basically, can you do this for the rest of your life? If not, then the trend is the problem, not the person. And Japan comes in as this giant example of restraint. Not overeating is doing a lot of work there before we even get to the food list. That phrase, stop at 80% full, is so simple it almost sounds fake. But it is probably more useful than half the wellness industry. And that DEXA scan story is where things get really uncomfortable. A slim person being told they are overnourished is such a mind-bender, because the body can hide danger inside a small frame. That is the whole skinny fat idea, right? You can look light on the outside and still be packed with visceral fat. A very malicious packing job by the body. Honestly, yes, the suitcase metaphor makes it impossible to forget. What I found fascinating is that fat is not just one thing. White fat, brown fat, subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, it is all doing different jobs. Brown fat being the good guy was the twist I was not expecting. It literally burns energy and can use harmful fat as fuel. So your own body has a built-in cleanup crew, and cold temperatures can activate it. Which is why the cold room or cold plunge stuff is not just macho theater. Not just suffering for social media then. Exactly, there is an actual biological rationale there. The mitochondria light up, and suddenly the body starts burning through the bad stuff. And then stress enters the room like an unwelcome guest. Cortisol is useful short-term, but constant stress changes metabolism. That is the part people ignore while pretending sleep and stress are separate issues. They are not separate at all, and neither is work stress. A guy working 7 days a week is not just tired, he is biochemically shifted. And that can affect where the body stores fat and how inflammatory it becomes. Which brings us to the dangerous part, visceral fat plus inflammation. That is where the cancer link becomes much less abstract. Because the fat starts to outgrow its blood supply and gets hypoxic. Then inflammatory cells move in and the whole thing starts leaking trouble. So the suitcase is full, the cream is leaking, and the organs are getting squished. That is grotesque and perfect. And the breast cancer study makes it feel very real, not theoretical. Normal-sized women, but the ones with more hidden body fat had triple the risk. 3 times the risk is not a small nudge. It is a massive signal that body composition matters more than people think. And it was not just breast cancer either. The list spreads into colon, ovarian, lung, prostate, and more. That is why the conversation is not really about vanity at all. It is about inflammation, risk, and the environment cancer grows in. Which makes the whole episode feel like one big argument for taking the body seriously. And not in a fear-based way, but in a very practical way. Food, movement, stress, sleep, and even temperature are all inputs. That is what makes it exciting, because so much of it is actionable. Also, protein printers and pomegranates is still an elite phrase. It really is, and it weirdly captures the whole episode. One end is deeply advanced science, and the other end is what you eat at home. That contrast is exactly why it sticks. All right, let's leave it there for this one. We'll come back with even more of the prevention and longevity angle next time. And in episode 4, we're getting into the bigger question of what actually makes a long, healthy life. See you there? Welcome back, because this one gets weirdly futuristic and weirdly practical at the same time. We're talking cancer genomics, immune vaccines, gut bacteria, and the fat you do not see. And somehow pomegranates are still in the middle of it. Which is honestly the most insultingly beautiful science sentence ever. The wild part is how the biopsy becomes a starting point, not the whole story. Right, because now the tumor gets sequenced like a crime scene. Not just what is it, but who exactly are the culprits. That's the shift that feels massive to me. You take tumor tissue, take normal tissue, and let AI do the subtraction. Basically, the computer says, nope, not that mutation, not that one either. And what's left are the smoking guns that actually drove the cancer. That's such a cleaner way to think about treatment than guessing from a playbook. Because the old playbook can be a little blunt, right? It often is, and people are told to follow recipes that do not work for long. But then the part that sounds like science fiction kicks in. They print the smoking guns as proteins and vaccinate the person with their own cancer. That sounds illegal in a movie, but apparently not in medicine. And the point is to wake up the immune system and make it hunt better. That glioblastoma example is honestly hard to wrap your head around. A cancer that usually feels like a death sentence, and then some people are still here. That changes the emotional temperature of the whole topic. And then the gut bacteria part makes it even stranger. One bacterium basically says, I decide who responds. Akkermansia sounds like a luxury skincare brand, not a survival factor. But that study was a huge clue for why some people respond and others do not. And then the whole question becomes, how do you actually grow it? Which is where the food list gets hilarious. Pomegranate, cranberries, Concord grapes, chili peppers, black vinegar. Nature really said, have a condiment and a miracle. That is the part I love most because it is not abstract. It becomes a daily behavior, not a lab-only miracle. And then he pivots into the diet debate, which is where people always get tribal. Keto people get militant. Vegan people get militant. Everyone gets weirdly moral about food. Food becomes a personality disorder with branding. His pushback is basically that sustainability beats purity. Because if you cannot do it for years, what exactly are you winning? Short-term suffering is not the same thing as long-term health. That Mediterranean point lands because it sounds delicious instead of punitive. And then Japan comes up, which is basically the under-eating lesson in one country. The key thing he keeps saying is they do not overeat. Harahachi banh mi, stop at about 80% full, which is rude to every buffet on earth. Buffets hate that one simple trick, but that leads into the really interesting metabolism stuff. A slim person can still be overnourished on the inside. That was the part that should scare more people than it does. Because body size is not the same thing as body composition. So your DEXA can say one thing while your mirror says another. The mirror is an amateur compared to the scan. And the whole skinny fat idea is brutally important. Visceral fat is the fat packed between the organs, not just under the skin. That's the dangerous one because it inflames the entire system. The suitcase analogy is annoying because it works so well. You can be lean on the outside and still packed like a badly stuffed carry-on. And once it grows beyond its blood supply, it starts starving and leaking inflammation. That's such a nasty chain reaction. Inflammation is basically what turns the fat from storage into trouble. And that is where cancer enters the picture because cancer loves inflammatory environments. Pour gasoline on embers and you get the same nightmare every time. And he ties that to actual data, not just vibes. The study on normal-size women with more fat and a 3-fold breast cancer risk is intense. That really kills the lazy assumption that only obesity matters, which is convenient for people who want to ignore what's going on under the hood. Under the hoodie, under the hood, under everything. Nice, okay, that was clean. What I keep coming back to is how much of this is modifiable. Food, movement, sleep, stress, cold exposure, all of it nudges the system. Even brown fat is basically the body's hidden ally. The fact that there is good fat that burns bad fat is almost too elegant. The body is basically a startup with a few brilliant engineers. And a lot of terrible legacy code. Brown fat lighting up in the cold is just wild biology. It was discovered in hibernating animals, which feels very old-school science. And then humans inherit the same tool if we stop overheating ourselves all day. That cold room, cold bath idea suddenly makes a lot more sense. But the stress piece may be the most relatable one of all. Cortisol is useful in bursts, but long-term stress is a different beast. And modern life is basically engineered to keep cortisol up forever. Work, travel, bad sleep, constant alerts, all of it. Then suddenly the body is storing and signaling and inflaming in the wrong way. So the big message is not just eat less or exercise more. It is build a body that can defend itself better, which is a much smarter and less annoying goal. Less annoying, yes, and also less impossible. I think that's why this episode sticks, because it does not reduce health to one villain. It's not just calories, not just genetics, not just one superfood, not just one drug. It's the interaction between biology and behavior. And that interaction is where hope lives. All right, let's leave it there for this one. We'll come back with even more of the prevention and longevity angle next time. And in episode 4, we're getting into the bigger question of what actually makes a long, healthy life. See you there.